Fasten your seatbelts, because tonight we're taking flight on planes that never truly landed. These haunted aircraft soar through the skies with ghostly pilots, eerie passengers, and tragic stories that linger at 30,000 feet. From mysterious disappearances to phantom flights, the skies are far from empty. So, sit back, relax, if you can, and get ready for a journey that will make you think twice about your next trip. Welcome aboard these haunted planes, where the final destination is unknown. Haunted planes are a unique and chilling topic. Air travel is often associated with mystery, especially when it comes to accidents, unexplained events, and lost aircraft. Here's a true haunted plane story that has captivated many over the years. The tragedy and hauntings of Japan Airlines Flight 123. Japan Airlines Flight 123, JAL 123, was a scheduled domestic flight from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to Osaka International Airport on August 12, 1985. What was supposed to be a quick, routine trip turned into the worst single aircraft disaster in aviation history. The flight ended in tragedy, claiming 520 lives. But that wasn't the end of the story. In the aftermath of the crash, eerie and unexplained phenomena started occurring, leading many to believe that the spirits of the victims still haunt the crash site and nearby areas. The Boeing 747 SR-46 that operated Flight 123 was nearly full, carrying 524 passengers and crew members. Just 12 minutes into the flight, as the plane was cruising at an altitude of 24,000 feet, an explosive decompression tore through the aircraft. The explosion occurred due to a faulty repair made 7 years earlier after the aircraft had been involved in a tailstrike incident. The rear pressure bulkhead burst open, causing the vertical stabilizer to rip off the plane and disabling all 4 hydraulic systems. With the plane now uncontrollable, the pilots fought desperately to stabilize it, but the loss of hydraulic power rendered most of the flight controls useless. For the next 32 minutes, the crippled plane flew in a terrifying up and down oscillation, while the crew tried everything they could to save the passengers on board. Eventually, the plane crashed into Mount Takamagahara, located near Ueno village in Gunma Prefecture. Only 4 people survived the crash. The tragedy sent shockwaves through Japan and the world. Families were shattered, and the crash remains a painful memory for the country. However, what happened in the years following the crash adds an eerie layer to an already tragic story. Almost immediately after the crash, locals and first responders began reporting strange events at and near the crash site on Mount Asutaka. People described seeing ghostly figures wandering around the forest, seemingly lost. Many of these apparitions were dressed in clothes typical of the mid-1980s, resembling those worn by the passengers on Flight 123. One of the most chilling reports came from a rescue worker who was among the first to reach the crash site. As he and his team were climbing through the wreckage, they claimed to have heard the cries and moans of people in pain. At first, they thought these sounds were from survivors, but when they searched the area, they found no one alive, just the remains of passengers who had perished on impact. The sounds of crying persisted throughout the night, despite there being no living person to account for them. Another haunting story involves a local villager who claimed to have seen a group of people walking in a dazed state near the foot of the mountain. The villager, unaware of the crash, approached them to offer help, but as he got closer, the figures vanished before his eyes. He later learned about the crash and became convinced that he had encountered the spirits of the victims, still wandering in confusion after the accident. One of the most famous aspects of the Flight 123 hauntings involves the taxi drivers in the nearby town of Fujioka. In the months following the crash, multiple taxi drivers reported picking up passengers who requested to be taken to Ueno village, close to the crash site. However, when the drivers reached the destination, they would turn around to find that their passengers had vanished without a trace. One taxi driver recounted a chilling story where a woman, dressed in a white morning kimono, got into his taxi late at night and requested to be taken to Ueno village. Throughout the drive, she said nothing, and when they finally arrived, the driver looked into the rearview mirror, only to discover that the back seat was completely empty. The woman had disappeared without making a sound. Other drivers reported similar encounters, with phantom passengers who simply vanished as the taxi approached the base of the mountain. Some drivers even claimed that their meters, which had been running during the trip, stopped working or displayed unusual errors after the ghostly encounters. Many believe that these phantom passengers are the spirits of Flight 123's victims, still seeking to return home or find their way to the crash site. These stories became so widespread that some taxi drivers in the area began refusing late-night fares to Ueno Village out of fear of encountering the restless souls of the crash victims. The ghostly activity wasn't limited to the crash site or the roadways leading to it. Several homes and businesses near the area reported paranormal experiences in the years following the disaster. One local family, who lived near the crash site, claimed that they began hearing strange knocking sounds on their windows late at night. At first, they thought it was an animal or a prank, but the knocking continued, becoming more frequent and louder as time went on. When they opened the windows to investigate, there was never anyone there. Over time, the family became convinced that the knocks were coming from the spirits of Flight 123's victims, seeking help or trying to communicate with the living. Similarly, workers at a nearby factory reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the building after hours. One worker described seeing a man dressed in business attire, standing at the far end of a hallway. The worker called out to him, but the man didn't respond. As the worker approached, the figure disappeared into thin air. Other employees reported hearing voices in empty rooms or feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and dread as they walked through the factory. Today, a memorial stands at the crash site on Mount Takamagahara, honoring the 520 lives lost in the disaster. The area has become a place of pilgrimage for the families of the victims and others who wish to pay their respects. Many of the visitors leave offerings, including food, drinks, and personal mementos, in the hopes that these gestures will bring peace to the spirits of the deceased. While the memorial provides a solemn reminder of the tragedy, it has also become a focal point for paranormal activity. Visitors to the shrine have reported seeing apparitions of people wandering among the wreckage or standing silently near the memorial. Some have claimed to hear faint voices carried on the wind, or the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, even when no one else is nearby. There are also stories of people feeling an intense, oppressive atmosphere when they visit the site. One man described it as a heavy sadness that seemed to envelop him as he stood near the shrine, making it difficult to breathe or think clearly. He later learned that the feeling lifted as soon as he left the area, only to return when he approached the crash site again. Though over 3 decades have passed since the crash of Flight 123, the hauntings associated with the disaster have not entirely faded. Locals still tell stories of phantom passengers, eerie voices, and ghostly figures that appear near the crash site and in the surrounding areas. For the families of the victims, the hauntings are a reminder of the lives that were lost so tragically and the spirits that, according to some, remain unsettled. While some skeptics dismiss the paranormal reports as nothing more than urban legends, others believe that the sheer number of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences cannot be easily explained. Whether these stories are the result of trauma, a collective need for closure, or genuine paranormal activity, the legacy of Japan Airlines Flight 123 continues to haunt those connected to the tragedy. For many, the spirits of the 520 victims have become as much a part of the story of Flight 123 as the crash itself, their presence a permanent reminder of the disaster that shook Japan and the world. The Ghosts of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, the spirits that never left. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was a routine flight from New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport to Miami International Airport on the night of December 29, 1972. The aircraft, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, was one of the most advanced planes of its time, equipped with state-of-the-art technology and considered exceptionally safe. But what began as an ordinary journey turned into one of the most tragic aviation disasters in U.S. history, and one of the most famous cases of a haunted airplane. What followed after the crash would shock even the most skeptical investigators: reports of ghostly apparitions, eerie encounters, and unexplained phenomena that haunted Eastern Airlines for years. Flight 401 was carrying 163 passengers and 13 crew members when it left New York on that fateful night. The flight was uneventful until it began its descent toward Miami. As the plane prepared to land, The crew noticed that one of the landing gear indicator lights, the one confirming that the nose gear was properly deployed, was not illuminated. Concerned about whether the landing gear was down, the crew decided to circle over the Florida Everglades while they investigated the issue. The captain, Robert Loft, and the flight engineer, Don Repo, attempted to troubleshoot the problem, but in doing so, they inadvertently disengaged the autopilot. As the crew focused on the indicator light, the plane slowly descended without anyone realizing it. By the time the crew became aware of their situation, it was too late. At 11:42 p.m., the plane crashed into the Everglades, breaking apart and scattering debris across the swampy landscape. Miraculously, 77 people survived the crash, but 96 passengers and crew members, including Captain Loft and flight engineer Repo, lost their lives. The crash of Flight 401 was a tragic accident caused by a combination of human error and mechanical malfunction. But what happened in the years that followed would make the crash one of the most infamous cases of paranormal activity in aviation history. Shortly after the crash, Eastern Airlines began salvaging parts from the wreckage of Flight 401, including components that were still in working condition. These parts were installed in other aircraft in Eastern's fleet, particularly in other L-1011 TriStars. It wasn't long before strange and inexplicable occurrences began to be reported by passengers and crew members alike. The first reports came from Eastern Airlines employees, many of whom claimed to have seen the ghosts of Captain Loft and flight engineer Repo aboard various flights. In most cases, the apparitions were described as lifelike and indistinguishable from living people, until they vanished without a trace. One of the most chilling encounters occurred on a flight from New York to Miami. A flight attendant noticed a man in a captain's uniform sitting in one of the passenger seats. She assumed he was a deadheading pilot, a pilot traveling as a passenger to their next assignment, but when she tried to speak to him, he didn't respond. Concerned, she alerted the flight crew, and when they arrived to check on him, the man had disappeared. Witnesses later identified the man as Captain Loft. On another occasion, a flight engineer was conducting a routine inspection of an L-1011 before takeoff when he encountered a fellow engineer in the avionics bay. The two exchanged pleasantries, but as the engineer turned to leave, he realized something was wrong. The man he had been talking to was Don Repo, the flight engineer who had died in the crash of Flight 401. The sightings of Loft and Repo continued to occur on various flights, with both passengers and crew members reporting eerie encounters with the ghostly figures. In some cases, the apparitions of Loft and Repo seemed to appear for a purpose, to warn of impending mechanical failures or other dangers. In one instance, a flight attendant saw Repo's reflection in an oven door in the galley. Repo reportedly told her that there was a problem with the plane and that they should check it. The flight crew inspected the aircraft and found a serious mechanical issue that, if left unchecked, could have led to a disaster. In another case, a pilot preparing for takeoff was startled to see Repo standing beside him in the cockpit. The ghostly figure warned him of a potential issue with the engine. When the pilot investigated, he discovered that one of the engines was indeed malfunctioning and needed to be repaired. Many of the sightings occurred on planes that had been fitted with salvaged parts from Flight 401, leading some to speculate that the spirits of Loft and Repo were tied to the wreckage and were watching over the flights that carried pieces of their doomed aircraft. In addition to the apparitions of Loft and Repo, other strange phenomena were reported aboard the planes. Flight attendants and passengers described hearing disembodied voices, footsteps in empty corridors, and cold spots that seemed to follow people around the cabin. In some cases, passengers claimed to feel an unseen presence sitting beside them or brushing against them. Electronic equipment would sometimes malfunction without explanation, only to resume normal operation moments later. Some crew members reported hearing whispered warnings or feeling a tap on the shoulder, only to turn around and find no one there. While these encounters were unsettling, they were not necessarily malicious. Many of the sightings of Loft and Repo seemed to suggest that the two men were watching over the planes and trying to prevent further accidents. In some cases, their warnings may have even saved lives. As the reports of ghostly encounters spread, Eastern Airlines found itself in a difficult position. The airline was already dealing with the fallout from the crash of Flight 401, and the last thing it needed was a reputation for haunted planes. For a time, Eastern Airlines attempted to dismiss the reports as superstition or the result of stress and fatigue among crew members. However, the frequency and consistency of the sightings made it difficult for the airline to ignore. Some pilots and flight attendants refused to fly on planes that had been fitted with parts from Flight 401, fearing that they were cursed. Passengers who had experienced ghostly encounters demanded answers, and the story of the haunted planes began to gain traction in the media. Eventually, Eastern Airlines took the step of removing all salvaged parts from Flight 401 from its other aircraft. The company hoped that by doing so, the hauntings would cease. And, for the most part, they did. Reports of ghostly sightings and paranormal activity aboard Eastern Airlines flights gradually dwindled. While the sightings of Loft and Repo may have decreased after the removal of the salvaged parts, the legend of Flight 401 has never fully faded. The crash site in the Florida Everglades remains a place of somber remembrance, and some paranormal investigators continue to explore the area, hoping to make contact with the spirits of those who perished in the disaster. The story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 has been the subject of books, documentaries, and even a made-for-TV movie, The Ghost of Flight 401, which aired in 1978. The case remains one of the most compelling examples of a haunted aircraft, with numerous eyewitness accounts from credible sources. To this day, many believe that the spirits of Captain Loft and flight engineer Repo continue to watch over the skies, ensuring that no other flights suffer the same tragic fate as Flight 401. The ghostly presence of Helios Airways Flight 522, the plane that flew itself. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Prague via Athens. The Boeing 737-300, carrying 121 passengers and crew, seemed like any ordinary flight, until it became a global mystery and tragedy. For nearly 2 hours, the plane flew on autopilot without any communication from the crew or passengers. When it finally ran out of fuel, the plane crashed into the mountains north of Athens, killing everyone on board. But the eerie legacy of Flight 522 didn't end there. Since the crash, strange occurrences and reports of hauntings have been linked to the doomed aircraft in the area where it went down. Flight 522 departed Larnaca at 9:07 a.m. local time. The captain, Hans-Jürgen Merten, and the first officer, Pampos Charalambos, were at the controls. Shortly after takeoff, the plane leveled off at its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. However, soon after reaching this altitude, the flight crew lost communication with air traffic control. Attempts to reach the pilots were met with eerie silence. Greek fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the unresponsive aircraft as it approached Athens. When the pilots of the jets flew alongside Flight 522, they saw something chilling. Both pilots in the cockpit appeared to be unconscious, slumped over in their seats, and the oxygen masks had dropped throughout the cabin. One of the jet pilots reported seeing a figure entering the cockpit, but the plane continued flying aimlessly, seemingly controlled by autopilot. After nearly 2 hours in the air, Flight 522 ran out of fuel and crashed into the mountainous terrain near the town of Grammatiko, north of Athens. All 121 people aboard were killed instantly. The investigation revealed that a pressurization issue had caused the crew and passengers to lose consciousness due to hypoxia, lack of oxygen. But what made this crash stand out were the ghostly encounters reported after the tragedy. Following the crash of Flight 522, stories began to surface about strange and inexplicable events in the area surrounding the crash site. Local residents reported hearing the sound of an aircraft flying overhead at odd hours, even though no flights were scheduled in the area. Some claimed they could hear the distant hum of jet engines, followed by a sudden silence, as if a plane had vanished from the sky. A farmer who lived near the crash site shared a particularly chilling account. Late one evening, as he was tending to his livestock, he saw a bright light in the distance, hovering over the mountain where Flight 522 had crashed. At first, he thought it was a helicopter searching for something, but as he got closer, he realized that no aircraft could be seen. The light remained stationary for several minutes before slowly fading away. The farmer would later claim that he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and dread as he watched the light disappear. Others reported seeing ghostly apparitions near the crash site. One man, hiking through the mountains, claimed to have seen a figure dressed in a pilot's uniform standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the valley. The hiker approached the figure, but as he got closer, the man in the uniform vanished before his eyes. The hauntings weren't limited to the crash site. Strange occurrences were also reported at Athens International Airport, where Flight 522 was supposed to land. Ground staff and airport workers began sharing stories of seeing ghostly figures wandering through the terminal late at night. One security officer reported seeing a group of passengers standing near a boarding gate for a flight that had long since departed. When he approached them to ask if they needed help, they disappeared without a trace. One of the most unnerving stories came from a baggage handler who was working late one night. As he loaded luggage onto a conveyor belt, he noticed a man standing in the distance, wearing what appeared to be a flight attendant's uniform. The man looked lost, staring blankly at the baggage carts. When the baggage handler called out to him, the man didn't respond and instead walked slowly toward the runway, only to vanish into thin air. The handler later described feeling a cold chill in the air and an overwhelming sense of unease. Perhaps the most mysterious reports were those from passengers waiting at the airport in Athens on the day of the crash. Several people in the terminal claimed they saw Flight 522's arrival displayed on the airport's information board, even after it was confirmed that the plane had crashed. Some passengers even reported hearing a boarding announcement for Flight 522 long after the aircraft was known to have been lost. One traveler, who had been waiting for a flight to Prague, recalled hearing the announcement for Flight 522 over the loudspeaker. Curious, he checked the arrivals board and saw that the flight was listed as on time. Confused, he asked an airport employee about it, but by the time they looked at the board together, the listing had disappeared. In another strange event, a gate attendant at the airport's departure area claimed that, on the anniversary of the crash, she received a message from a flight crew member asking for clearance to land. At first, she assumed it was a mistake or a prank, but when she checked the records, there was no flight scheduled to land at that time. The request seemed to come from a plane that didn't exist, Flight 522, lost but somehow still echoing through the skies. The crash of Flight 522 left many families devastated, and some of them experienced strange, haunting dreams in the weeks and months following the disaster. Relatives of the victims described dreams in which their loved ones appeared to be trying to communicate with them. In some dreams, the victims were seen boarding the ill-fated flight, while in others, they were sitting calmly in the cabin, smiling or waving goodbye. One woman, whose husband had been aboard Flight 522, reported having the same dream for weeks after the crash. In the dream, she saw her husband sitting by the window of the plane, looking out at the clouds. He would turn to her, smile, and then turn back to gaze out the window, as if he were at peace. The dream brought her some comfort, but she also felt that it was a sign that his spirit was still tied to the tragedy of the crash. Other families reported similar dreams, with their loved ones appearing in peaceful or serene settings, often in the sky or on the plane. While the dreams were often comforting, they also left the families with the eerie feeling that the spirits of the victims had not yet fully moved on. Even the investigators who worked on the crash site reported strange occurrences. Some claimed to have felt an inexplicable coldness in the air, despite the hot summer temperatures in the mountains. Others said they heard faint voices or whispers as they searched through the wreckage, though no one else was around. One investigator recounted a particularly unsettling experience while reviewing flight data from the black box. As he listened to the final moments of the flight, he claimed to hear what sounded like a voice in the background, whispering something unintelligible. Initially, he thought it was just interference, but when he played the recording back multiple times, the faint whispering voice persisted. It was as if someone on board the plane was trying to communicate, even after the disaster had occurred. The most bizarre part of the Flight 522 hauntings involves reports of a ghost plane seen in the skies over the Mediterranean. Several pilots flying commercial and private aircraft have reported seeing an unmarked Boeing 737 flying at a high altitude, following a similar flight path to that of Flight 522. When they tried to make contact with the mystery plane, they received no response. Radar operators also reported brief, unexplainable blips that appeared to represent an aircraft before disappearing entirely. One pilot, flying from Athens to Prague, claimed to have seen the ghost plane in the distance, flying parallel to his own aircraft. He radioed air traffic control to ask if there was another flight in his vicinity, but they told him there was no other plane on his radar. As the pilot continued to watch the ghostly aircraft, it suddenly vanished, leaving him and his crew bewildered. Helios Airways Flight 522 remains one of the most tragic aviation disasters in history, but its haunting legacy has left a lasting mark on those who survived and those who investigate the paranormal. The unexplained sightings, ghostly encounters, and eerie phenomena associated with the crash have only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the event. Some believe that the spirits of those lost on Flight 522 are still trapped, reliving the final moments of their doomed flight, while others see the hauntings as a form of unresolved trauma, lingering in the physical world. Whatever the explanation, the ghostly presence of Flight 522 continues to haunt the skies over Greece and Cyprus, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the mysteries that still surround the world of aviation. If you've landed safely, consider yourself lucky. Some flights never really end. If these ghostly tales left you gripping your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell before the next flight takes off without you. Thanks for flying with us, and we'll see you on the next one. If you're brave enough to board again.